Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Norrid, Interim Executive Director at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we talk with practitioners, scientists, academics, and other social justice leaders at the intersections of faith, climate change, environmental justice, and the other social justice issues of our time. And this morning, we are very lucky to have on Dr. Marshall Shepard, who has been a friend to GIPL and obviously involved in the climate movement for quite some time. Dr. Shepard is a full professor at the University of Georgia's Department of Geography, director of UGA's Atmospheric Sciences program. He's also the Georgia Athletic Association's Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Sciences and Geography, and a whole other list of accolades that we do not have time to go over today. Dr. Shepard, thank you so much for being on.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, and very happy to be talking with GIPL again. I have done quite a few things with GIPL over the years, and so it's happy to be back in your fold.
Well, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you got into doing the work that you're doing as a meteorologist and a researcher now.
Well, my degree, I have 3 degrees, including a PhD in meteorology, but I depending on what hat I'm wearing on any given day, I'm a climate scientist, an atmospheric scientist. My core research and interest are in meteorology, extreme weather events, and so forth. But over the last 2 to 3 decades, I've increasingly been engaged in climate science, climate communication, and so forth. First, at my previous career as a scientist at NASA, Goddard Space Flight Center, working on big climate satellite missions, and has continued when I joined the faculty at the University of Georgia. Um, I'm a scientist that believes we can't stay stuck in the ivory tower. We've got to be out there and engage with policymakers, stakeholders, faith-based communities, and so forth. So if we're not there, people with disingenuous or devious intent will happily fill the void that we leave behind. And so that's how I've increasingly been engaged in climate and related activities.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you again for being on. And I think that you have a reading from one of your books to offer this morning.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I've written 3 books over the years, but my most recent book is actually a book inspired by what we've been living and seeing after in the post George Floyd, Breonna Taylor era. I'm an African American scientist, and so not only do I bring perspectives on climate, I bring perspectives on being a Black man in this society that's dealing with racial justice issues. And interestingly enough, race, climate justice, and science integrity all are woven together in some of the very issues we're facing in society right now, whether it's the climate crisis, racism, or coronavirus even. So I wanted to read this quick passage from my latest book, The Race Awakening of 2020, Six-Step Guide for Moving Forward. And the reason I read this is because I'm often challenged as a climate scientist. I'm often given sort of skeptic or denialist sort of rationale that it's actually blasphemous or it's against faith to say that climate is changing or that humans can in some way affect the weather when God is omnipresent and omnipotent. So I wanted to sort of shatter this narrative that somehow we as scientists aren't of faith. So let me just read what I wrote here at the beginning of chapter 8 of my book. My faith is an important part of who I am, though I do not necessarily wear it on my sleeves. Speaking of religion to this point, I haven't said much about it. I was baptized at Hickory Log Baptist Church in Canton, Georgia. I am generally a person of faith, but as a child, I didn't particularly care to go to church. It wasn't really because of what was being said in church. It was more a disdain for the process of sitting there for 3 hours. I have trouble doing that anywhere. And so I think about that because in my days as a youth, I mean, typical sort of Black Southern Baptist church, long services, lots of songs in the choir and so forth. But a lot of how I navigate my space as a father, as a husband, as a scientist is underpinned by my faith. And so I think it's important to understand that we can certainly talk about science and controversial quote unquote issues, and it does not compromise who we are as people of faith.
Yeah, thank you for that. Before we dive into the more science-based stuff, I thought I'd ask, what are some of the ways in particular that um, your faith traditions both maybe inform your work on climate justice and your lens for climate justice and environmental justice work, and then also some of the ways that you've talked about working with faith communities in the past, or trying to have those conversations about faith and science. I think any of that would be great to hear about.
Sure. Well, I think from a climate perspective, I think the earliest scriptures of the Old Testament are pretty clear about our stewardship of Earth, and this notion that somehow we can impact it or affect it in some way. That's not how I see what the Scripture says at all. I mean, it gives us dominion and stewardship over this planet, and so there are things that may happen to it because of our negligence. And so I think that there's this underlying sort of guidance of us as a climate scientist that I am trying to be true to that notion that we're stewards. And when I see that there's degradation to our environment, to our climate, but then when I think about scripture that says the greatest of these is charity or the greatest of these is love, uh, that really is at the core of what guides me. Because how can I sit there and when I know that there are marginalized populations or the least vulnerable in our communities that are bearing the brunt of extreme hurricanes and flooding and drought and urban heat islands? I mean, these are the people that, frankly, if you're of the Christian faith, at least, these are the people that Jesus would have gravitated towards as well, because they were the people that were least likely. But even in other faiths and religions, there's scripture that talks about this very same concept of helping those in need, loving thy brother or sister. And so I think those are always at the heart of. And so when I see mean spiritedness in others that are denying climate or saying this is about uh, hoaxes and tactics, it's just to me fundamentally opposite to what I read in scripture. And it's ironically, some of the very people that say those things are people that would also proclaim their faith.
Yeah. I know today that we're going to talk a little bit about Project Georgia Drawdown and some of the solutions that points out and some of the impacts that we had the opportunity to make through that. But before we do that, I wanted to kind of set the stage a little bit on some of the stuff that you have worked on. I mean, exactly what you just said. We know that low income communities, primarily communities of color, face the impacts of climate change disproportionately. We know the same is true for energy burden and pollution and environmental justice issues. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that more generally, but then kind of go into some of the intersections that you talk about between the weather gap and the income gap and how those are related to some of the things that we see.
Well, absolutely, and you're probably referring to. I gave a TED talk at Howard University in Washington D.C. a couple of years ago, and I talked about this idea of the weather and climate gap. It's no different than the income gap that we've seen for decades in this country, and it actually establishes our vulnerabilities to things like it's not by accident that more African Americans and marginalized populations are dying from coronavirus. It's the
Right.
same thing. And when we talk about climate change, it's the exact same income gap. There's an old saying in the Black community that when the rest of the world catches a cold, the Black community always gets the flu. And
Mm.
that's exactly what we are seeing with coronavirus. I guess we could actually say we get coronavirus at a greater rate. But it's also what we see in climate change. And not just here in the US. If you look around the world, the idea of the emergence of climate refugees, people that are literally going to have to leave their homes because of sea level rise or losses in agricultural productivity in Africa. They're going to have to move to other places. They're going to be displaced. We saw a little of that with Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean, other smaller islands. People literally have left those homes and gone to Florida and other places because they had nowhere else to go because of a weather climate incident. And so it's always the people, if we think back to Hurricane Katrina, in New Orleans, the people that were in the Superdome, they were the people that, unlike me, if there's a hurricane coming and I lived in that area, I mean, I could go to another city for a week and buy a hotel room. I have insurance on my home. I have proper health insurance and home insurance and so forth. Many people don't. And so that is a direct manifestation of the income gap. And then it in turn, through exposure sensitivity and lack of adaptive capacity, leads to higher vulnerability for those communities. So it's a part of this whole concept of climate justice, which I guess is a spinoff of environmental justice. But there are subtle differences between environmental justice and climate justice, but they're all grounded in the same discriminatory practices, injustices we've seen in society. For example, even just recently, there's new work that came out that suggests that some people in cities live in hotter parts of the cities because of historical redlining practices. So we know that these things it's all connected.
Yeah, you mentioned briefly here and also in your TED Talk kind of the layering of adaptive capacity and resilience, um, and how maybe some of the ways in which kind of that affects the ways in which communities can mitigate or face the effects of climate change, and specifically, how does issues of um, adaptability, adaptive capacity, and resilience look here in Georgia?
Well, it really depends. It depends on where you are. I mean, one of my students, one of my former doctoral students, Dr. Benita Casey, and I published some work back in 2015 on climate vulnerability per county in Georgia. So we looked at which counties in Georgia were most vulnerable to climate change. And what we found is it was certainly those counties that are very poor, but also are equally experiencing things like heat waves, drought, and flood. Um, what we know is vulnerability and adaptive capacity. So just break down. Let's kind of do a little 101 here on vulnerability as defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Vulnerability is a function of three things: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure is the event, it's the hurricane or it's the drought or the heat wave. Sensitivity is how sensitive we are as people, how are we impacted by. But that term in adaptive capacity and resilience is okay, how are we able to bounce back? And what we find is that depending on which county you live in Georgia, there are different adaptive capacity needs or adaptive needs. So, for example, in the southern part of the state, in the rural agricultural regions, people are most vulnerable to climate from the perspective of lost wages and jobs when there's extreme drought. And many of the jobs in those fields or agricultural fields are typically vulnerable at the whims of the drought. And so the resiliency there is, you need job training or different job options for those people in those communities. Along the coast, obviously, we're dealing primarily with a sea level rise vulnerability and a storm surge vulnerability. So there you start thinking about things like seawalls and other things to mitigate against sea level rise. But in the cities, that's where we found quite a bit of vulnerability to heat and flooding. And as I said, that redlining study that came out there's de facto segregation that has led to populations in cities being more vulnerable to heat. And then you throw on top of that summer heat waves and the specter of increasing warmth due to climate change. And so you have created a public health crisis now. You have created an energy crisis in the sense that these people are going to be paying more for air conditioning in the summer. And so I think their adaptive capacity or resiliency needs, they're centered around ways to mitigate heat in those communities with cooling stations, adequate air conditioning, and so forth, and even just broader public health care or good health care for people, that because they're going to be dealing with more health related issues because of climate.
Yeah, this kind of varied risks across the state, but also some of this intentional and explicit um, systemic issues that we've talked about. And I wonder, digging into your book a little bit more, the Race Awakening of 2020, uh, and how explicit and systemic racism play into conversations about climate, um, especially, yeah, how it relates to that book and some of the work going on in Georgia. So maybe two steps, kind of generally, and then also some of the things you mentioned about this state.
Well, racism is all about, as I talk about in the book, I define racism because I often find that people don't really know what it is. Racism is very much rooted in the power structure of an economy or a society. And so uh, I think I gave the example in the book of two squirrels in the forest. Well, imagine if there's one squirrel living in that forest the entire time, had access to all of the nuts. But then all of a sudden, here comes another squirrel. All of a sudden, that particular squirrel that had access to all the nuts and power feels persecuted or perhaps not as equal because now he's having to share the equity in the nuts there. And so he somehow feels attacked or feels less powerful. And I think that's sort of some of the tension that we're seeing here as we see. I think about the fact that when we were kids, we stood and pledged allegiance to the flag, and I think it ended with "in liberty and justice for all." That's what we were told to do in school. And that's all we want now is justice for all. And so I think that's what the other squirrel wants justice. He wants his equal share in that. And so I think that drives this perspective where the way I see, or perhaps the way someone else sees a George Floyd incident or the way someone else sees the images of people evacuating from Hurricane Katrina varies because of our marinades or our own personal perspectives on the situation. And we see that at the local and state level too. I mean, in terms of the implicit policies, there may be some that say, well, why are we helping that community? They should stand on their own and rise on their own bootstraps. I did it. Well, guess what? You didn't have historical constraints. You had a head start historically because of things like redlining and segregation and so forth. And so, there's a reason that certain communities in southeastern Chicago are dealing with significant crime rates. And I bring that up because that's always thrown in our face. Well, you're not complaining about the black on black crime in Chicago or in other places. Yeah, we hate that too. We don't want to see that. Absolutely. But let's talk about the systemic reasons that the socioeconomic fabric of those communities have created that situation. Let's not talk about the fact that there are certain institutions that, as citizens, we feel they're there to protect us. It's an apples and oranges discussion. And so those are some of the things that I deal with in the book. And these things kind of then translate over to the broader climate discussion because, for example, one of the solutions on the table is the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal is controversial in some circles. It's talking about an all a renewable energy economy, moving away from fossil fuels, but tied into the Green New Deal are very specific sort of policy, levers that deal with equity and justice issues too. And so we're going to see that going forward, and you're going to see some of these racial buzzwords and code word issues coming out in the climate discussion over time.
Yeah, we've talked about a couple of times on the show with different guests, kind of um, the intersections of these different systems, that the devaluing of Black bodies or low income communities in certain policy discussions are the same ones that allow for those communities to experience these disproportionate impacts of climate change or environmental justice, because it allows for those communities to be devalued in such a way that then of course pipelines are pushed through those communities, or there are plants put up in those communities, or they're experiencing hotter heat waves because of redlining. And so maybe on the same topic as the Green New Deal, what are some of the policy levers that you think can help those communities, and how do you go about kind of doing um, some education to demonstrate to people why all these issues are connected?
Well, I think the first before we go to policy levers, I think that people in these communities have to understand climate and environmental issues aren't just about polar bears or 2080 or a butterfly in Mexico. It literally is about their economic and public health well-being. And so they need to be informed climate voters and not just see this as some affluent issue. Because I've been in these communities. I'm from these communities. My families think about these types of things, and they may be tempted to say, well, I'm more worried about how I'm going to pay for my next utility bill or where I'm going to get my health insurance from than me worrying about climate change. But when they understand that they're intricately tied to those very topics, including race, I think that they will become more engaged. But then the policy levers, we have to have policy levers that think, as you sort of suggested previously in one of your remarks, about an adaptive capacity. Because the big picture for climate change is mitigation. We've got to reduce carbon emissions, and that's what Drawdown Georgia is all about. These solutions that are in these various baskets to reduce carbon in food systems, transportation, buildings, and other areas that we've talked about in Drawdown Georgia. But even if we do all those things are decades away from having a difference, candidly. There are going to be things that we're going to have to do now for communities, which fall more into the adaptation basket than the mitigation basket. And so at state and local levels, we have to think about, strategic greening in cities, or perhaps smart albedo or other building material solutions that are cooling. I'm working with a project with the engineers at Georgia Tech on something we're call engineering cities for thermal justice. And so we're thinking about a completely different paradigm for how we engineer cities to make just the heat more equitable across cities. But then obviously it comes down to basic things that people think about anyway: adequate health care, because we're going to see a higher incidence of heat and upper respiratory issues, heart disease, and so forth because of these heat stresses and other things, and adequate housing insurance and mortgages so that people can have more equity in where they choose to live. Because right now, for example, 60 to 80% of African Americans live in flood zones in the Charlotte to Atlanta I-85 corridor, based on studies from one of my graduate students. So there are policy levers that are screaming at us if we have the public will to do them.
Yeah. Thank you for setting us up for a perfect transition into Georgia Drawdown. And so last week we had a conversation with John Lanier about how Project Georgia Drawdown came to be, kind of why that was important, what that project is seeking to do. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of the solutions in that project and kind of why it's important to look at some of these state-specific paths to reducing carbon, what those are for Georgia.
Right. And I will say that we rebranded to Drawdown Georgia instead of Georgia Drawdown about several months ago. It actually started off as Georgia Drawdown, but some public relations folks came in and said, we think you should lead with Drawdown. So
Drawdown Georgia.
I find myself saying both as well. So I just wanted to make sure the listeners understand.
Definitely.
Because Drawdown, they said, had the brand, because as you know from talking with John Lanier, I mean, it evolved from the broader Project Drawdown. But to answer your question, Project Drawdown has these 100 solutions, for reducing carbon emissions. But all of those don't work for Georgia. We don't have tropical forests or some of the things that were specific to drawing down emissions. So the Ray C. Anderson Foundation funded a consortium of researchers, including Georgia Tech, University of Georgia, and Emory University, and now Georgia State, to investigate the numbers, to find out of the solutions, which set could be most impactful for Georgia, that have meaning for Georgia. And we're in the process of actually unveiling those 20 to 25 solutions, but they were kind of grouped into different baskets: transportation, buildings, food, land and forestry, even something called beyond carbon. So I don't have all the full range because I've been focused on certain ones, but you start seeing things like electric vehicles, composting in the food sector, even family planning. When we think about beyond carbon, this idea of planning families and population issues and so forth, composting, afforestation, forestation, all these types of things. So I would encourage him, and I don't know exactly when this will air, but as we're taping this, at least we're in the midst of the big reveal. And on the Wednesday of this week that we're taping, we are going to reveal our 20 plus solutions that we think are most adequate for Georgia.
Yeah, I would encourage everybody to tune into that.
We'll have that. This is live, right?
Yes, this is live.
So tomorrow, I just recalled tomorrow, and there's information on the Drawdown Georgia page where you can find information on getting the web link. It's at 2:00 Eastern. All of us on what we call the Drawdown Georgia core team are going to participate, as are many of the working group leads, are going to be unveiling, literally. It's almost like our public coming out party of what these solutions are. So I encourage you to engage there. And if you want more information, there is a Drawdown Georgia website. Also, you can follow us on Twitter at DrawdownGA, and there's information on where you can find the information on that webinar.
Yeah, we just dropped a link into the comment on Facebook, so you can click that and get the information about the workshops. And you can also check on GIPL's website at gipl.org for more events related to Georgia Drawdown. So I'm excited to see that slate of solutions from you all, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to get a shameless plug, because I also interviewed John Lanier for the Weather Geeks podcast that I host for the Weather Channel. And that's still the current episode through tomorrow. We debut a new episode every Wednesday. So if you want more of John Lanier, shout out to John, you can definitely check him out on the Weather Geeks podcast as well.
Absolutely. So you mentioned some of the solutions from Drawdown Georgia.
Yes.
And we'll obviously see more of that tomorrow with the unveiling. But you talked about kind of something that we don't often like to talk about, which is, yes, there are all these solutions to drawing down carbon. We can reduce emissions. We know what we have to do over the next several decades to do that. And yet, even if we eliminated all of our carbon today, new greenhouse gas emission, we still have the effects coming down the pike from the emissions that are in the atmosphere. And so transitioning from kind of reducing carbon towards these ideas of climate resiliency and disaster preparedness, could you talk about how those two are related and how those kind of conversations can practically play out, especially here in Georgia?
Well, I mean, WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, released a report just last week talking about the trillions of dollars that we've experienced in climate related disasters over the last 30 years and the millions of lives lost. And they ended that press release with something that I thought was very poignant. It said, we have to start asking what the weather will be and start asking what the weather will do. And I thought that was very powerful because we know that things are changing about storms and drought and heat waves and floods. And they're going to have impacts on everything from our infrastructure to our energy grid to our transportation network to our health insurance and so forth. And so, first of all, from an emergency preparedness and resiliency standpoint, local jurisdictions, state jurisdictions, FEMA, and so forth have to fundamentally, I believe, change how they do business. They need to understand that in Hurricane Michael that barrels through northern Florida and then destroys most of our agricultural crop in Southwest Georgia. That's not necessarily a one-off anymore because the science tells us that we might not have more hurricanes in the future because of climate change, but when we do have them, they're going to be stronger. And so there's a likelihood that a storm with 100-mile-per-hour winds can make it into Southwest Georgia as Hurricane Michael did. So we need planning strategies in the emergency management community that are operating with that paradigm in mind. The farmers in those communities, those that are designing bridges along the coast, need to fundamentally change how they design infrastructure. The reason cities flood, like Atlanta floods more frequently now, is they're fundamentally flawed. They were designed under the assumption that the engineering for stormwater management in those cities would be as susceptible to the storms of 1970, the rainstorms. It rains very differently now. I mean, we know that. So they assumed something all stationarity. Oh, it's going to rain in 1960 the way it rains in 2020, but it doesn't. The top 1% to 2% rain events in terms of intensity are much heavier now. And so we have to fundamentally build that into not just the science and the engineering, but the planning and the decision making. And that's something that I've actually been spending more of my time thinking about in the last 5 to 10 years. How do we literally get scientists and policymakers and practitioners talking to each other, not just going to a conference or a workshop and hearing presentations from each other, but fundamentally immersed in working together?
Yeah. So when it comes to Drawdown Georgia and the solutions that are proposed there, sort of the inflection points for making the most change here in Georgia on reducing carbon emissions, that that process lays out kind of a list of solutions similar to Project Drawdown. That it's this robust series of solutions that are kind of there that we know what their impacts are. But then what we have to do is we have to take those solutions and somehow implement them into policy to change kind of the systemic fabric. And so could you talk about that a little bit?
We don't know what we're going to do yet, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I'll build on that statement because it's a little more than that. But first of all, let me just talk about why Drawdown Georgia was so important and why the Ray C. Anderson Foundation stepping to the plate to enable this funding. We have numbers. We now know we didn't just kind of go look at these and say, yeah, we think composting will work, or we think sort of whatever the other solution. We actually did the numbers and know what the numbers are in terms of carbon savings over a certain period of time, 2030 range or so forth. So we have the numbers. That in itself was groundbreaking. That was in itself was novel for any state to go and dig that deeply into looking at these 20 solutions. So I want people to understand and listen to this. We didn't just like lay out this list of 20 solutions. We laid out a list of 20 solutions. And as you'll see in the webinar tomorrow, there are very specific numbers. Even our Twitter and website presence that we'll have very accessible graphics to talk about the so what, because again, a lot of this stuff, candidly, and I'm a keep it real guy. A lot of this stuff is wonky science stuff if you dig into it from a Drawdown Georgia perspective. The end consumer, the person that really on the back end is not going to care about some of the science and technical details of how those numbers are arrived at. They want to know, okay, so what? What is the amount of reduction and what has to be done? Which gets to your question. And that's really where part of phase two comes in. Now, I know that the Ray C. Anderson Foundation is going to fund a follow-on carbon tracking effort so we can start tracking and doing some things. But this is just the beginning. We need support. And I'm going to publicly say this. the team needs a phase two that really involves thinking about now how do we transition this into action, not just for the state, local, and federal governments, but for Fortune 500 companies and smaller companies here in Georgia. That is actually something that we've had on the table. We have a plan. We just need a little support to actually move it forward. So.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that kind of this is the beginning of a journey for this, um, for these solutions and how we implement them through policy. And, and this may be the question I'm about to ask may be kind of a like, we don't know how we're going to do that either. But when we're thinking about these solutions and policy ways to implement them, do you have thoughts or ideas about how to ensure that the implementation of those solutions takes into account things like justice and equity for the communities in which they're being implemented?
No, I think that's why we need the what I call the sort of implementation phase of this project, because I think as we think about, again, we have some ideas on the table for how to engage policy and decisions and take it to the next step. But I think part of the quote unquote research, again, we're researchers, is to understand the implications of doing that in the most equitable and just fashion. And so I think any component of that next phase would have to think about those issues. So I know that there are some people out there that have talked to us and expressed interest in and asked this very next question. Yeah, this is all great, but what's next? How do we get into policy? That was never the intent of phase one of Drawdown Georgia. We did what we answered the mail of what we said we would do. But of course, the next natural question is, then how do we get it there? And then how do we get it there in the decisions and policy equitably? And that's where we're ready to take it if someone's willing to step up and partner with us.
Yeah, I'm grateful for you all have laid the foundation, I think, for what the conversation can be for the next several decades on. We know what the most impactful solutions can be. If we want to take this seriously here in Georgia, we know what they are. Now, how we do them, we
Right.
have to figure it out. How we do them equitably and justly, we have to figure out, but we know what they are.
Right.
And that's more than we've ever had.
Yeah, that was all we said we would do in this project, and we did that. But again, the natural next question is, all right, next, now what? And that's
Right.
obviously our question as well. And like I said, we've thought about it. We've sat down and put some things on paper. So it's just a matter of these things don't, a lot of this stuff has taken on. Yeah, I think people would be surprised at the number of people that have been involved in this effort. We have weekly conference calls with the team. There are 6 working groups with multiple people in those working groups, plus a core team of scholars from Georgia, Georgia Tech, and Emory and Georgia State. And so it's a large effort, and that next step is, I think in some ways, is going to be larger, because now you have to engage the policymakers and the decision makers within certain companies. And I think things like the Business Roundtable effort that the Ray C. Anderson Foundation is funding through over at Georgia Tech, through my colleagues Beryl and Toupé and Michael Goodman, are a step in that direction. I think we do have some inroads. I mean, I want to give a shout out to Representative Chuck Estration, who actually is the state house member from my district here in Dacula, Georgia, where I'm sitting right now, who has introduced a climate study bill in this house. He's a conservative, by the way, and I mention that on purpose because climate change and the climate crisis and equity issues aren't left-right issues. I mean, the drought or the hurricane doesn't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. It just happens. And so, he's moving the needle there in the sort of the government space. The faith-based communities and the leadership of GIPL and others are very important. So we've got the right people at the table. This idea that this is some partisan issue, I believe, is starting to erode. Even with the upcoming presidential debate Thursday, there are 6 topics chosen. Guess what 2 of them are? Climate change and race, things we're talking about right now. So these things are on the table. Now we've got to, I've long said the discussion has kind of moved on from, is this happening and what are we going to do? Now we actually have to create the templates for how we make these things happen in a policy or our business setting.
And you highlighted something that I think was really important that we haven't touched on yet, which is the consideration of these solutions and the implementations of those solutions are individual, they're communal, they are policy decisions at kind of the local and state legislative bodies, but they're also companies, they're businesses, they are kind of all those layers. And could you maybe speak a little bit more to the importance of kind of all of those sectors and why it's important to implement these solutions kind of in all of those sectors?
Yeah, well, I think Ray Anderson is an embodiment of that because he fundamentally changed the game in terms of saying, I can still make a profit and care about the environment. Well, it's so odd to hear some of the counter arguments on climate change because, from the lens that I look at, there's economic opportunity in a new economy centered around renewables and centered around new technologies that are going to make buildings cooler and pavements cooler. That's a whole new, almost climate industrial revolution in itself that we're on the cusp of, in my view. And so, what's encouraging though is that we know businesses are interested in this. AT&T just issued its climate resiliency challenge last year, where it put out a call for universities to help it think about climate resiliency, because their infrastructure and their bottom line depends on, understanding and what's happening with stronger storms and more rain and so forth. Often in one of my talks, I talk about an article in the New York Times where the vice president Coca-Cola talks about their fundamental bottom line profit is dependent on, beet sugar beets and citrus fruit and water availability, all things that are very much entangled in the climate web. And so we will not move forward at all on any of this if businesses aren't at the table. Upton Sinclair once said it's difficult to get a man or woman to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding. And that has been at the root of a lot of the climate denialism for many years. If you go back and read Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes, is some of the same people involved early on in the information sort of misinformation campaign. But I think in the last 5 years there's been a shift. I think businesses understand that they better get on board with this real quickly and get off that sort of old school prehistoric thinking of, oh my gosh, this is going to hurt me, to, oh, it's going to hurt me if I don't do something. And more importantly, there's opportunity in this. And so I think that's what I'm seeing. I think we're in a transition point, and I think we've tapped into some of that. Just some of the conversations I know that people like Beryl and Michael are having with their business roundtables and so forth.
Well, Dr. Shepard, thank you for giving us some of your time. We're almost done, and so I'll ask you the final question that we ask all of our guests here, and then I'll end with a quote that you actually brought to my attention. So the last question is, what are you missing the most in a COVID-19 world, and what's given you hope to keep doing the work that you're doing?
What I'm missing the most is just normal things. Being able to sit there and watch the Braves got at least challenged for a chance to go to the World Series or go to a concert at the Atlanta City Winery or so forth. Those are just things I like to do personally. Because, candidly, I'm a big sports guy. Most sports started back. I can watch it. My daughter plays volleyball for high school. We're going to state tournament tomorrow. So those things are there, but just the regular, I honestly, when I'm not in work mode, I really do try to decouple and move completely away from it and just enjoy things that I like to do, like music and concerts and sporting events. So that's what I miss the most. What gives me hope is that I do see faith-based communities, people from all political persuasions, being around college students, the college student energy. There's movement. The denialism, and I mean, it's out there. You still got the crazy uncle at Thanksgiving dinner spouting crazy theories and things like that. But that stuff's waning. It's going down. I saw it in a recent Six Americas study. The dismissive category of their study, of their Six Americas, is continuing to decline. So, I think that's what gives me hope. Even with all the crazy shenanigans, pulling out of Paris, treaty and those things, a Paris Agreement rather, even at state and local levels and in corporate sectors and so forth, there has been movement. And I'll end by saying that if you are interested in my book, The Race Awakening of 2020, it is available on Amazon right now.
We'll put a link to that as well in the chat for everybody. So definitely order this book and read it. Dr. Shepard, thank you so much for coming on and offering all of your perspectives and your brilliance as usual. I wanted to end with what you actually end your TED Talk with. As I was reviewing some of your work in preparation for this call, it definitely highlights some of the intersections that we've talked about here. So this excerpt from MLK's letter from Birmingham jail. It says, moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you again, Dr. Shepard.